Hello, everybody, and welcome to Friends of the Force, a Star Wars podcast. I am your host, Brad Whipple, and it is Thrawn Day, Thrawn Chismas, you could call it potentially, but Chismas in September? It's almost October. I've lost track of time. What is time?
Yeah, time doesn't exist.
It's still March 13th. Welcome, Sarah Haas. Welcome back. How's it going?
Heyo, things have been much better, as you can tell by our inability to know dates. But we're here, and there's things to be grateful for.
But here we are, talking about Thrawn, the first in a new trilogy. We're starting fresh out the kitchen. So on today's episode, we're going into full spoiler territory and discussion on Thrawn Ascendancy Chaos Rising by Timothy Zahn. It came out earlier this month in September. It's not October, it's September still, surprisingly, somehow. And we're going to talk about our thoughts up front, go through some of the themes that we saw throughout the book, some of our own mythology that we noticed, because we're now mythology experts, I guess you could call us that, and talk about some of our favorite characters from the book, because there's a lot of different people in comparison to some of the older stuff that Zahn has written. A lot of exciting new characters that we were introduced to, and some familiar ones that we've expanded on. But before we get into that, Sarah, there's a lot happening in the world right now. Indeed. There is. Indeed. There is a lot. Friday night was a rough one. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, which is just heart-wrenching to say the least. She was such a staple of law in our country, and especially like for women's rights, and not even just women's rights, but like gender rights in general. She did a lot of great work just around like sex discrimination. It was just really, really sad to see her leave this world so unexpectedly in a year that has already been tough to begin with. We want to just take up a couple minutes up front to talk about voting. Rock the vote, Sarah. It's so important to vote. You have a civic duty. You're like endowed with this amazing ability to go to the polls and bubble in your choice, who you want to vote for. And that's really cool, right? Because not a lot of people have that ability, because it's either taken away from them or it has obstacles placed in front of it to the point in which they can't vote. And in some other countries, there aren't democracies, so you can't actually vote on the candidate that you want. It's just chosen for you by an elite group of people or from a family, a bloodline. And it's pretty neat, Sarah, that we get to do this. So I just wanted to tell you all, it's very, very important on November 3rd to go out and vote. And if you don't feel comfortable going in to vote in person, you should get an absentee ballot, which you can do. And that's really cool too, because you just vote right from your couch, right after you finish reading Thrawn Ascendancy Chaos Rising and listening to this podcast. You just vote right after this.
Yeah. So I work on a campaign, and I also have a degree in political science. And so this is a thing that, as somebody who studies stuff and also just as a person, that I care a lot about and hope you get involved with. You know, there's been a lot of talk with regards to racial justice and Black Lives Matter about what the institutions are doing, versus what you can do outside of the institutions, which is like protesting. And I just want to place value on both methods of activism and using your voice outside of the system as well as inside of the system. So while I encourage you to protest and continue to do that because it is so important, I also encourage you to vote. You can check your voter registration at vote.org or at your county clerk or state board of elections websites. Early voting and mail-in ballots are accessible to most people with some obstacles, so definitely make sure you are informed about your area's policies, your state's policies about receiving an absentee ballot, about early voting, about what happens if you change your voting plan, and make sure you're clear on all the steps. If you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, DM me. I am always happy to help. When it comes to campaigns, we saw a lot of people donating to campaigns after Justice Ginsburg's death. It looks like Act Blue raised over $200 million, which is amazing and incredible generosity. But I encourage you, if you donated, to also be willing to give up 2 hours of your time once a week or once every other week to call or text or write postcards for a campaign. Campaigns need your help because they need to energize voters in their state or region or district to turn out those voters. Some especially important Senate races this year, we have in the opportunity to flip the Senate blue, are Iowa. Georgia has both seats up for grabs. One is a special election and one is a regular election. Arizona is another really important place with a special election going on. Maine, Sarah Gideon is running against Susan Collins. So there's a lot of races, whether locally in your area or at the national level or the state level, that you can get involved in. And I really, really encourage you to do that via phone banking, which you are calling voters, via text banking, which you are using a script to send out a text to a bunch of voters, or through postcards, which get sent in the mail, obviously. Again, if you have any questions about that at any time, feel free to ask me or DM me at SEH221 on Twitter. I am always, always happy to help.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't talk a lot about these issues too often on the show, but we felt it was really important just with Ginsburg's passing to bring light to just kind of what's happening in the world, because we're at a really pivotal point in our country and our democracy, and we want to make sure that those institutions remain intact, remain strong, and remain for the people. So just go out and vote this November, because that is just the one thing you can do. It's not going to solve all of our issues, but it's a start in the right direction, and it's your first steps into a larger world. We can say that.
Our democracy is fragile, and we need to be involved with it in order to make it better. It will not just get better on its own. It takes every single one of us to, be in the streets, be voting, be engaged, be calling your senators and Congress people, to really just be aware of what is going on in the politics locally and nationally. We are in a very precarious situation, and I really deeply, truly encourage you to take action on that.
So again, we thought it was important to discuss this on the podcast and use our platform for that, and we'll include links to some of the resources that you can use in the description of this episode. But as Sarah mentioned, reach out to either of us if you have questions or if you want to get involved further. But we're going to get into Thrawn Ascendancy Chaos Rising by Timothy Zahn. So, Sarah, let's talk right up front our kind of spoiler-free take on this book, and then we can go full spoilers. So, I will start by saying, if you were not a fan of the first Thrawn trilogy, this might actually be for you. I was not the biggest fan of the first trilogy. I thought it was a bit repetitive in many parts, very dense in a lot of others. Didn't necessarily give us a side of Thrawn that was challenged in a lot of ways. And I was wanting something more, and I also wanted something more in terms of the actual Chiss race and how their society worked and like where Thrawn came from, because it's fine to have all of his stories in the context of the Empire, which is familiar to us, but to actually get that story from where he came from and some of his origins was a lot more interesting to me. So that's what really drew me to this book. And when Mark Thompson first announced the book at New York Comic Con last year, when I was in that room and he read I think it's the kind of first page of this book, I was like, holy crap, I want that book because it sounds great. And it was. It introduces a lot of new characters. It's not just told from Thrawn's perspective, which I think this book has that advantage in not giving us his first person point of view, because that became really repetitive and boring throughout the first trilogy. But it was nice to actually just get kind of everybody else's point of view about Thrawn. And I think that's what allowed this book to just feel more cohesive overall. And it's something new in Star Wars. It's not, again, it's a new original story. It's stuff that's not familiar to us, and we need more of that in Star Wars. We need to branch away from the Skywalker saga, the Rebellion, the First Order. We need to branch away from all of that stuff, kind of let the past die and tell some new stories that are just completely different and completely weird, and also just kind of interesting and open our eyes to new places in the galaxy. So, Sarah, what was your spoiler-free take on this book, and would you recommend it to readers?
Well, I had an exchange with Kyle Larson earlier this year, and we were talking about the Thrawn books on Twitter, and I was like, yeah, I've decided I dropped Thrawn Treason not for me. I'm not putting myself through an unpleasant experience, and I don't intend to read any more Thrawn books. And he was like, good choice. And if it weren't for this pod, I probably would not have picked up the book. But like, oh my God. Oh my God. I'm glad. I'm glad I did.
Yeah, you weren't even sure if you wanted to review this book with me.
I have gone through so many levels of confusion. It has been a long personal journey. This has been a very complicated and confusing time for me because I'm just saying to myself, I like Thrawn?
What?
Oh, I can't even believe I said that out loud.
You've been converted.
I have been converted. I get what people are saying now, like honestly, because I feel that this book, by taking it out of Thrawn's perspective and putting it into this third person perspective, really strengthened my understanding of Thrawn as a character. When you get out of his head, I think you're able to know him better. And this book did a great job of that by giving us more of the political system, more of the world that he lived in, more characters, a larger scope. I think it all benefited from that difference in perspective. And I really like this book. And I think that if you, like myself, were not a Thrawn fan, would never pick up a Thrawn book in 100 years, after reading one or not reading one, I recommend giving this one a shot. I really think that it creates an environment where these characters become likable.
Mm-hmm.
It's so surprising.
Yeah, and Eli Vanto definitely got a lot of limelight in the previous trilogy. I would say as it went on, less so. Like the first book, he really was pretty prominently featured. But I really do think it was that first person to third person switch that made this book work. I really think it like boils down to that, honestly. And the addition of the Chiss culture, but like really not having paragraph after paragraph of like Thrawn recognizing the muscles twitching in somebody's arm or face and like the brow furrowing and all these things that he was like recognizing. After a while, it becomes very just redundant. Mm-hmm. So not having that anymore. And like you said, like learning about him through other people's eyes is the most effective because every person has a different take on Thrawn, right? He makes some enemies in this book who view him one way, and he has a lot of allies who view him in a completely different light. And having that sort of juxtaposition and difference in judgment really helps us, the reader, to craft our own view of Thrawn and who he is. This book definitely isn't without its flaws. I think there are definitely still, plenty of flaws you could pick out in the book. Mm-hmm. But relative to that first trilogy, this is like a head and shoulders improvement. I'm so excited for what's to come in the next two books. And I would absolutely recommend this to anybody because you can look past those flaws. They're not flaws that destroy the story or made me want to put down the book. They're just your kind of everyday run-of-the-mill flaws that every book has. And that's really cool to know this book actually really hooked me in and took me for a ride through the chaos. Pun intended.
Yeah. I think also want to pay my respects to Eli Vanto, who was definitely the best part of that first Thrawn book, who I came out really enjoying and was hoping to get more of in Treason, but then I DNF'd Treason, so don't know where he ended up. I guess I should consult Wikipedia or whatever. I will say about the flaws of this book, the more I sit on them, the more that I don't think that some of them are excusable, and I think we'll definitely get into that later, but at the same time, I don't feel that the flaws that I'm thinking of ruined the reading experience for me. There's definitely things that I want to talk about and say because I think they're important to talk about, but I was able to still enjoy my reading experience in a way where other flaws have brought the whole book down for me in other books.
Yep, absolutely. So, and also this just made me want to know what happened to Thrawn after Rebels. I'm very convinced.
Where is he?
I'm very convinced that this trilogy is actually going to end with that answer. I don't know if publishing will take that risk or if they'll even get the okay from Filoni or how much of a say Filoni actually has in what happens next to Thrawn, because Thrawn's still kind of like Zahn's brainchild. So like, I don't really know where those lines are drawn to the sort of way that Ahsoka is like Filoni's character. When I first heard about this book, like my headcanon though was like Thrawn and Ezra like sitting around a fire, like destitute on some planet, and they're like having a bonfire under the starry sky, and like Thrawn's telling Ezra all about his days as part of the Chiss Ascendancy and when he met Anakin Skywalker, and he's like literally telling him all of this, and that's what we're reading, and that's eventually like where the third book would end up, is figuring out what the larger framing device of this whole trilogy was. And they're like, now you know where Thrawn is, and it's like, oh my god. But I don't know, Sarah. That's like my dream for this trilogy, how it ends, and then it leads right into like a Rebels sequel series. I don't know, but I want it. Please.
I love that idea. And I kind of love that idea within the framework of like the Christmas truce, like in World War I, because I still think they're at odds with each other. If they're on an island planet together, they're grumpily on an island planet together. Mm-hmm. Like they don't get along. But I find it interesting, the idea of him giving Ezra these stories. So that's a really interesting headcanon, and somebody should make that art. And also, Del Rey, make it happen. Zahn, write it.
I mean, it's kind of like when Zeb and Callus had to fend off those crazy spider things and survive with each other, and Callus definitely grows a little bit of a soft spot for Zeb, which we ship it for sure. But yeah, I always love the trope of like, let's put aside our differences, white flag up for a night and just talk, and we'll go back to being enemies in the morning. So who knows, Sarah, but to be determined in like 2 years when the third book comes out, which is crazy to think about. 2 years, that'll be Celebration in Anaheim. So I wonder if they'll release the third book at that convention with like an exclusive cover. So who knows? That would be pretty cool. They can have like one final panel about the series.
All right. Are you ready to be in line at 6 a.m?
Listen, I always rush the Del Rey booth first thing like a crazy person, and I'm pretty sure Tom is going to see me once again. At some point. Tom, if you're listening, you will see me there.
Did you know that I was in the line at 6 a.m, I think on like Friday morning, and
you're crazy.
We ended up being on GMA.
Wow.
Yeah, you can see me in the background of GMA. I'll show you the clip later.
That's exciting.
Yeah, we were like, oh, it's local news. No, it's GMA.
Well, that's sort of our spoiler-free, larger scope perspective. We can't really continue talking about the book in a spoiler-free mode, so from here on out, spoilers only. You have been warned. If you don't want to know what happens in the book, turn away and read it, because you should. Reading's good for your brain.
Everybody dies. I'm so glad we got that spoiler out of the way.
Yes.
Just kidding. It's not real.
Dumbledore is dead.
Yeah, Snape kills Dumbledore.
What? Okay, Sarah. I wasn't saying who killed Dumbledore, but for all of our listeners who have never seen Harry Potter, you've just spoiled it.
What? Do you mean never read Harry Potter? This is a reading podcast in this episode, Brad.
Okay. We're just going to move past that. It's fine. Let's just spoil Sixth Sense while we're at it, too. I'm just kidding.
Whoa. I haven't seen Sixth Sense. We can't do it.
I see Chiss people. Anyways, so Sarah, I'm going to give a quick overview of the plot of this book, just to kind of put into context our conversation. And for those of you who maybe like don't want to read it and just want the like higher level perspective of what happens, here is what happens. And Sarah, let me know if I miss anything. Thrawn is sort of this growing cadet who everybody sees like, he has a lot of power, a lot of knowledge. He's going to use that power for either good or bad, destroy the Ascendancy or save it. We don't really know yet, but he's a pretty cool kid, I guess. Some people hate him, some people love him. And he grows up, and the Ascendancy, which is kind of at the heart of the chaos, and it's the capital of the Chiss, it gets attacked, and they go on this sort of follow the ship, follow the paths, interrogate a few people here and there, politely interrogate, ask questions, slyly maneuver their way into situations where they can get more information out of other people. And they ultimately find that there is this force of people called the Nick-Gardoon. They are sort of taking over all of the surrounding planets in the unknown regions, almost encroaching towards the Chiss Ascendancy. So Thrawn sees that this threat is coming. Nobody really believes him. It's kind of like a boy who cries wolf sort of situation, but there really is a wolf there, and Thrawn is the boy. And nobody believes him. Ultimately, it goes on this wild bantha chase to eventually defeat everybody, and Thrawn kind of outsmarts him at the end, which is always Thrawn's way of doing things. And lo and behold, there is one bigger baddie behind it all, and I'm scared. And his name is Jixtus. So Jixtus is gonna come F everything up in book 2, I guess. And that's where we're at.
Yeah. I will say in this book as well, we see Thrawn paralleled from his youth, his early times in the academy, aside or alongside his time as an officer in this conflict with these different species and conquering peoples. And it reminded me a lot of Star Trek. So at the end, you could be like, Jixtus, is he Khan? Question of the day. Is Jixtus Khan?
Yeah, and I actually like that book, how they intersplice the memories with the current day events, because you're seeing how Thrawn learns all the things that he's doing. And I thought that it didn't always feel like too on the nose, like, okay, yep, that's how he learned it. It actually felt like a very natural progression. Like Thrawn's always been having these sorts of ideas of how to have the Chiss navigate within the chaos and within the unknown regions, and like what their place is. So it was interesting to now kind of see him take more control over that destiny of his people and almost try to like guide them regardless of what they say. And that's kind of just his character, and I love it. He's just like, I don't really care what anybody says. I'm just gonna like capture the ship or shoot all these people out of space or just like give some hostages over and see what happens. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, you're crazy, man.
Yeah, a really interesting piece of this book is the political context which in Thrawn lives, and it's a very complicated, very patriarchal, very hierarchical, very uppity political sphere. And here Thrawn comes as a merit adoptive, somebody who is not part of these one of 9 families, 9 rings of power, Mython of Frodo. Your tweet.
Yes.
One of the 9 ruling families, and he's brought in and he becomes a disruptor, but he knows that his path will end up in the result that he wants to, which creates some ruffles some feathers of those people who are within the system and believe deeply in their power within the hierarchy, which creates some interesting conflict.
Yeah, the whole book, Sarah, I love politics. I love politics in Star Wars.
What?
Prequels are great.
Me? Loving politics in
Yeah.
Star Wars? I would never think that. Just kidding.
And this book takes place between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, so there's just a lot of political things happening. And to now get politics on a completely isolated place in the universe is just so fascinating, because you're right, it is this constant, like, even though their primary motive is to protect and defend the Ascendancy, like that second order, they talk about at one point the hierarchy of priorities. I think the second one is like your family. So you always try to make your family, or your family of people, whether it's the Myth or the Arizi, you always want them to be on top of the Ascendancy, but the Ascendancy always comes first. And sometimes those kind of motives can align themselves, and sometimes they don't. It's kind of like, are you going to supersede one directive over the other to better your family in kind of a selfish way, which we do see some characters like Thurfian, for example, who's always after Thrawn. I think he's more in it for like his particular family and wanting to better himself. And he's a little bit jealous of Thrawn. It's all fascinating. We'll get more into that stuff, but I love that. And it kind of makes me think of the cover of the book, which is Thrawn standing at the sort of apex of this triangle, and there's those 2 snakes kind of weaving in between each other. And that's part of a design on a ring that he receives at one point in the book. And on the ring, there's the 2 larger snakes, but in the middle, in the center of those snakes, is a smaller snake. So it kind of actually speaks to how art speaks to cultures and societies. That specific one almost speaks to the Chiss, whether or not it was meant to, but how the Chiss are always trying to kind of get over the smaller snakes and be the bigger snake in the situation and kind of show their dominance over one another. It's interesting. It's a kind of interesting imagery on the front cover of the book. And it's called Thrawn Ascendancy. So I'm wondering, Sarah, what do you think of that title in general? Is that the right title for the book? Do you think it should have been called something else? But certainly chaos is rising in this book.
Yes, chaos is indeed rising. Also, yes, it should have been called something else. We're getting one of those moments where it's like Star Wars, colon, Alphabet Squadron, colon, book 2, colon. Like that's what this title feels like. It's like Star Wars, colon, Thrawn Ascendancy, colon, book 1, Chaos Rising. And it's a lot, and I think they should have not included the word Thrawn, because that is what the turnoff was for me about reading this book initially. I didn't want to read another Thrawn book. I think it should have been called Chaos Ascendancy, or no, sorry, Chiss Ascendancy, Chaos Rising.
Agreed.
Because I think that is a much more apt title to what we see in the book, and also to the overall dynamic in general. And I think it brings people in a different way than the word Thrawn does. Thrawn may be your Thrawn may bring your Thrawn base, which is probably large, and that's probably why they named it Thrawn. I think for the people who are not Thrawn fans already, it can be a bit of a turnoff. So I wish it had been just titled Chaos Rising or Chiss Ascendancy Chaos Rising, because Thrawn, for me, is like a red flag. Don't read this.
Yeah, I think it would have appealed to a much larger audience, and I hope more people read this book, because other than what the title might tell you, there is so much more than just Thrawn. Like we're saying, there's this political stuff going on, social, family stuff going on. There's a lot of new species and enemies coming into the fold. It's a whole mix of people, and there's a lot of focus on a lot of the women characters as well, like Aralani and Shiri and Thalius. Like there's so many new characters that we really get some insight to. And yes, they're not written perfectly, and we'll talk more about that. But the fact that they're actually included in this book is really an exciting part. I want to talk a little bit about the chaos, because that's definitely a core component of this book.
Mm-hmm.
And it's where we sort of begin with the intro paragraph, which states, "An island of calm within the chaos. It is a center of power, a model of stability, and a beacon of integrity. The 9 ruling families guard it from within. The expansionary defense fleet guards it from without. Its neighbors are left in peace. Its enemies are left in ruin. It is light and culture and glory. It is the Chiss Ascendancy." That's more describing the actual Chiss Ascendancy, but the fact that there's this chaos surrounding the Chiss, which is, as they're describing it, it's sort of this like pure place that is like an ideal safe haven. It's very perfect. It's almost like a utopia in a way. It was actually really fascinating to learn how all of this chaos came to be created. It talked about how a long time ago there was all these different chain supernova explosions that rippled throughout the chaos, and it destroyed worlds, sent asteroids everywhere. And there was this electromagnetic flux that created all these different hyperspace lanes that were constantly changing. So it was nearly impossible to navigate the chaos, because it was always rapidly changing. It was never the same, which is almost kind of like sounding a little bit of High Republic to me, which I know the High Republic is sort of in that realm of things, of traveling in hyperspace and trying to find the way for the Jedi as they explore the galaxy, kind of the wild, wild west. Is that kind of what you picked up here?
Yeah. There's also a mention of like the Great Sith War, or this great war that happened that also caused some of this, for lack of a better word, chaos to occur within these systems and regions. And if you recall from the one excerpt that we got from the beginning of The Light of the Jedi, which was featured in some news article, it was about some sort of catastrophe, disaster. And so I am wondering if these things are the same thing, if they're connected. And also the paragraph that you said from the beginning, it really paints the Chiss Ascendancy as this mythological, this very, I know, I'm just like hinting at this transition. So clean, so good. This mythological, this very high-ranking, ethereal, majestic kind of idea. And, we learn that it's kind of not all that, but the way that it's painted and the way that they wish to be seen is very telling throughout this story in how they describe their world and the world of others.
I am wondering how, if at all, the Chiss will fit into the High Republic, because, like you said, there was the Great War with the Sith and the Jedi, and the Chiss, Thrawn mentions at one point, did not fare well with all those events. So I'm like, what does that look like? Maybe we'll learn a little bit of history there during the High Republic. It's interesting. All of this sort of stuff you're talking about made me kind of wonder the meaning behind chaos, why it's called the chaos, and I stumbled upon this thing called creation myth, and I was like, "Ooh, I'm gonna read that." It says myth in it, and myth, haha, Thrawn is a myth. Myth. So, so creation myth is this narrative in which it describes how the world came into existence and how people came to inhabit it. And mythologists have tried to classify this over the years and fit it into certain schemes, and one of those being creation from chaos. This idea follows the thinking that initially there is nothing but a formless, shapeless expanse, and chaos in this case means disorder, and it's from that disorder that there is the bringing of order. So the act of creation is that order from that chaos. There's many of these different cultures that believe at some point the forces that preserve order will weaken over time, and the world and the universe will once again become engulfed into an abyss and into chaos. So like chaos, from chaos, order is created, but at the same time that order can go back to disorder and back into from whence it came, which is the chaos. So I thought it was interesting that among all the chaos that was happening, all these supernova explosions, the Chiss Ascendancy was created. So at some point, that Chiss Ascendancy could just as easily be destroyed and kind of fade right back into the chaos, become one with the chaos. And I kind of almost feel like that's what Thrawn is worried about. He is worried throughout the entire book of this sort of supernatural force that is lingering on the outskirts of the Chiss Ascendancy and is encroaching on their territory slowly, trying to kind of distract them from not necessarily to draw their attention elsewhere, but to really draw it inward and to keep them so focused on themselves and so much of an isolationist society that they forget about those dangers that could rupture their whole world.
I mean, you were really thinking like Jixters, if you ask me. You were like, haha, the Chiss Ascendancy can be destroyed. It can fade away again. That's some real Jixtus energy. We don't know anything about him, but Brad, are you Jixtus?
I might be. I might be that man that appears at the end of the book.
I guess we'll find out. Book 2, coming to us in 2021. Yeah, I thought this was really interesting when you came upon it, and this idea, there's many ideas of the creation myth and ways to interpret creation, but this one about chaos and creation from chaos and the way that you can see the order within the disorder, really, to me, is a great way to talk about it and a great way to consider how we talk about chaos, or how the Chiss talk about chaos, how versus they talk about lesser space. That designation and how they call others aliens, to me, they see themselves literally as the gods, which I thought is really interesting.
I was looking into like the definition of chaos itself, and it's often thought of as kind of being the first thing to ever exist. From kind of everything else is formed from chaos, and that's in like Greco-Roman tradition. And the ancient Greek poet Hesiod, he had this poem called Theogony in 700 BC, and that's how he described the chaos and how Earth formed from it, the ancestral mother of all life. There was Tartarus, which was the deep abyss where the Titans went and were imprisoned and judged after they died. There was Eros, which is the Greek god of love and sex. So this ancient Greek poet believed all these other things came from the chaos. And again, likewise, the Chiss are very they're very self-introspective people. They don't necessarily think that they're better than everybody else. And I think Arlani mentions this at one point. They just don't realize that there are anybody else to feel superior to. They think that they're really the only ones, and they never want to get involved in other politics. And that's kind of the core of this book is, again, Thrawn says there's a threat. Everybody else just doesn't want to get involved. There's no reason to attack unless we're being attacked. Why would we put our Skywalkers out into the chaos and threaten their lives when we can just sit tight and not worry about it. We can just use our defense fleet and shoot down any ships or any intruders. Like, who cares, you know? But I don't think they realize just how valuable their society is and how pure and how much of a utopia it is, that people want that when there's so much danger happening outside of that civil world. People want to come in and like encroach on that, and that draws the danger to them very quickly.
But also, it's important to note that the utopia is a facade. We see that
Right.
Sheila is like been frozen over, and nobody really lives there anymore. Everybody lives underground, but they maintain this facade of the city, and they rotate people in and out of it. So their entire political system, their entire ruling families, this paragraph that we get at the beginning of the book is the facade they're painting. And it's so interesting to see how Thrawn disregards in a lot of ways the facade. He doesn't acknowledge it because he thinks that there are more important things than the facade.
That's definitely going to come back into play at some point, right? That, I mean, the fact that we learned about all of that, about that city, how it's meant to almost lure in outsiders to waste all the resources attacking a ghost shell of a city, that's going to come back into play at some point, I feel like.
It reminds me of those dystopian books that I read when I was a kid, where like everybody lived underground because the world was so inhabitable, and how they all wanted to get back above ground. So I wonder if we'll get
the City of Ember.
That's exactly what I'm talking about, Brad.
Oh my god, I forgot about those books. Holy crap, I love those. I love that series.
Guys, the best one is the third one, the prequel, The Prophet of Yonwood. Oh my god, so good. You know, they want to live above ground. They want to get out of the spaces they're in. So I'm wondering if we'll ever get any of the citizens' point of view, and how the citizens see the regular everyday, not part of the 9 ruling families, syndicure, whatever, aristocra. Not those people, but the people who live under all of that, quite literally. I'm curious.
Mm-hmm. But why do you think the Chiss are so isolationist? Like, why do you think they actively choose to just not get involved? Do you think it's because they've worked so hard to create this utopia, and that they really just care about, they're just so loyal to the Chiss Ascendancy and their families that like nothing else matters? Like, why is it that they can't see the threat and see that that threat will eventually impose itself on those priorities that they have?
To me, it seems likely that they have the privilege not to care about that in a lot of ways, because they live in this very narrow world of the handful of planets that make up the Chiss Ascendancy. They only have to care about their narrow slice of space, quite literally, if they really want to, because they don't interact with lesser space and the Clone Wars and all that stuff, and they don't have to care about those things. And they also, this facade is more important to them than their own problems in general. I think of a place like North Korea, where the facade, it's not a very good facade. Nobody really believes in it, but they keep their image up in a way. They present themselves in this very particular way in an attempt that the rest of the world sees them in that way. Mm-hmm. And I think, I'm not saying that Chiss Ascendancy is North Korea. I'm really not. But I think it's an interesting comparison, because they both have this political machine that is quite broken in a lot of ways, or is really not perfect in any way, but that they keep because it's what they've had, and it's what retains power for the people in power.
And we kind of jump right into that at the very start of the book, right? I mean, they're getting attacked, and we're kind of seeing the shit show that is ensuing. And Bakif, let me tell you, I like Bakif a lot, actually. Yeah, I think he's a great guy.
Me too.
It kind of gave me this sort of like Situation Room vibe, where like all of the leaders of the free world, or maybe in this case, you know, the leaders of the United States, they go under the White House and they meet in the Situation Room. That's what this kind of felt like to me, and that's why I was like, oh yeah, West Wing and Star Wars, let's go. And I was getting amped and seeing how they were all kind of clashing over their different personalities, different MOs. They all wanted something different, and Bakif is sort of the mediator amongst all of them, and just being like totally annoyed by everybody. And in general, the social system of the Chiss is interesting, because there's a syndicure and they try to be thoughtful, noble, and unflappable, and have much more of a say in military matters than Bakif would like. He wants them to have less power, and he wants that power to stay with, I guess, the aristocrat, I think it is. It kind of all like is like gobbledygook to me, honestly. I mix them all up, but essentially there's this constant back and forth between like who should be having a say in military matters and who should not, and Bakif is always trying to sway one way versus the other. And I think that's interesting. It's like, who really does have a hold on military matters in this? Like, is military matters being so heavily influenced by social factors, by family, by politics, and that kind of muddying of the waters is something that we see in our own, country, in our own political system, and to see that ever present in the Star Wars universe, I think is really interesting. And I think that's on purpose. I think, again, Star Wars has always been very political, and for Zahn to bring that into the Chiss Ascendancy, I think was a natural thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I remember correctly, and again, I will say I'm not trying to like dive into a con of this book or a low point of this book, but it's so dense when it comes to the system and the culture and the plot and the military, and that it becomes a little bogged down, especially when so many of the names are TH names.
Oh my God, we haven't talked about that yet.
We haven't even gotten there, but
oh my
there is so much happening. And if I remember correctly, Bakif is a little bit more on the outside. He has some more belief in Thrawn, whereas people like Zistalmu and Thurfian and other aristocra/syndicure people want more family influence. At one point, the Arizi was trying to bring Thrawn in so that he could have the Arizi name for his position in the military because it would gain them more power, right? But then Aralani had to give up her name as Ziara and leave the Arizi once she got to a certain point in her military career. So it seems very, very complicated and a hot-ass mess. And yeah, that's all on purpose. And maybe it's a little bit of Thrawn being like, I can make this complicated because I can. But I also think that there's something to say about the fact that none of these systems is really free from the other influential systems.
Yeah. But I need to address too, Sarah, you brought up a great point. This book, oh my God. Like, for the first time in a long time, I kind of just felt like, I don't know how to pronounce words anymore.
Let me tell you.
Like, I went to college and I can't pronounce things. What the hell?
The audiobook was a godsend.
I can imagine.
When it came, I have so many notes. They're all in blue about, and I will phonetically spell every single name that pops up. Like, you would not think that Wutrao is pronounced Wutrao, but it's pronounced Wutro.
It's insane. There were so many apostrophes too. I think
so many.
Tom said there were like 4,900 or something, which that's a lot of apostrophes. They should have called this Apostrophes Rising, honestly.
Yeah. Apostrophes Rising. Oh no, perhaps apostrophes rising, comma, indeed.
Perhaps is Thrawn's favorite word. That was said so many times. I think at one point he literally said it like 4 times on a page. I swear to God. But I'm okay with it. It's his word. He has ownership over it in the Chiss Ascendancy. He has trademarked the word perhaps.
Indeed. I think it was 1138 at 1138 on Twitter who made a graph of the uses of the words indeed and perhaps throughout the Thrawn books. So if that's something that interests you, it's around.
Yes.
Graphs, data, woohoo!
So I want to ask you, this is all taking place in the context of the Clone Wars, and we don't necessarily know that the Clone Wars are really happening. It's kind of out of sight, out of mind, except when we get to chapter 17, where shit gets real. At least I was kind of mind blown by how Zahn wove some of his stories together. So it slowly is turning into this chase after a Nubian ship, and I'm like, that's weird. That's like Padme's ship. And then we end up at Batu, and I was like, that's weird. This is the second book. And then somebody says their name is Skywalker, and I'm like, that's weird. This is the plot. I was like, what is happening? Did they meet another time before the Thrawn alliances? I'm so confused. And then I quickly realized that we were seeing the other side of things and how Thrawn got to that point. there's a kind of a break in the book where we don't hear much of Thrawn, but then afterwards we find out this is after his journey with Anakin to rescue Padme and Thrawn Alliances, which is the second book of Zahn's first trilogy. It just kind of gave some context to when this is all happening, which I thought was interesting, and also made you remember, like, hey, remember at some point Thrawn ends up with the bad guys. He ends up in the Empire. That's on his horizon. That is in his future. So, like, what gets him to that point where in book 1 he is banished from the Chiss Ascendancy because clearly he does something really shitty? Or maybe the Chiss Ascendancy get destroyed despite his warnings, and he is sort of just left as the last Chiss. Like, I mean, he's not the last Chiss, but like kind of the feeling that way, you know, like that his people failed him. I don't know. We just don't know what actually happens with the Chiss. But it was just a nice reminder to say, like, hey, this is coming at some point.
Firstly, big Jixtus energy with how we got from A to Z. Feels like Jixtus might be involved in that. Really don't know a single thing about Jixtus, but I am looking. I think it is Jixtus. But I have to disagree with you on chapter 17. While I feel that this was something he had to do because of the timeline of the story, and it makes sense that he had to add this in here, it, to me, did feel a little heavy-handed, just because we were within the Chiss Ascendancy during this whole book, really, and then we, like, leave for a little bit, and then there's Duja, and there's Anakin, and we're talking about Padme, and we're on Batu of all places. Like, anytime Batu pops up in a book where Batu is not the place where the book takes place, like Crash of Fate, it's just like, this feels like a plug of, you know, a theme park kind of, and so I did feel like it was a little out of place with the tone of the rest of the book, but within the context of the story and how the other characters weaved into that story, specifically with Thalius taking the trials, I thought that it was done well from everybody else's point of view except for Thrawn's. Like, I didn't love how it was incorporated on Thrawn's side, but I like how it included Cherie piloting and Thalius taking these trials and stuff.
Mm-hmm. It was a breath of air for, I think, what was a very constant back and forth book between, like, back to the Ascendancy, now back out to some planet, now back to the Ascendancy, now back out to some planet, which I might say is, like, one of the downsides of the book, where it kind of all started to blend together, and I was losing track of, like, where we were and where we've been. And so I really would have rather had us maybe be just out in space for much of the book and communicating with the Ascendancy versus, like, having to, like, constantly come back and forth. But I get that. That's part of, you know, the Skywalkers and the fact that you can do interplanetary travel so quickly and so rapidly. But it got kind of confusing. But, you know, I don't disagree with you, actually, that, you know, I think this wasn't really necessary to have in the book. They could have maybe saved it for later on, possibly even. But I thought once I just kind of accepted it, I was like, oh, okay, it's kind of fun. We're seeing the conversation between Cherie and Thrawn as they're talking to Anakin, and how Thrawn's like, that's a strange coincidence that his name is Skywalker. Whoa, that's weird.
Which there were highlights in this, and then there were, like, low points in this chapter. And a highlight is that comment, because there's something there that we have not quite dived into. Where does the Skywalker name come from? And I'm not saying, like, who is Anakin's dad, but, like, I'm saying
it's a Chiss.
There is a meaning behind this name, and why this name, we call it the Skywalker Saga, why that is also this part of the Chiss Ascendancy, and they have this role navigating and that sort of thing. In addition, another highlight is the mispronunciation gag. It's so out of place because it's a joke in this book that does not have a lot of funnies, but it's so funny, especially in the audio, when he's like, this is wrong. He goes, no, you're wrong. Like, it's funny, but I will say that the low point for me in that chapter was, do we have an alliance? And I was like, no, you did not just do, like, the title of the book that is not even this book it killed me.
Although, to be fair, I think that's, like, dialogue ripped straight from Alliances, which we know to be not a great book. So I think that's less a problem for this book and more still a problem on Alliance for being involved with this book.
It still was like, oh no, I know exactly what we're doing here. Like, oh no, I know exactly what we're doing here, kind of a thing.
Yeah. It was funny, definitely, and I just have to think of Hayden Christensen and like Thrawn interacting live action. I think that would be so funny, hearing Hayden Christensen try to say Thrawn's name in a cockpit of his ship over the comms and just being so confused. And R2's like, "What the hell's wrong with you, dude? Just say the name right." I don't know. That's a fun headcanon.
The best part is that, like, I don't even understand where the mispronunciation is coming from in the audiobook. It's like, he's like, Mithron Naruto. And he's like, no, Mithron Naruto. And you're like, where is this even happening? Which makes it all the funnier.
Yeah. Now that we've talked about sort of how the chaos operates, how the Chiss operate, being, very isolationist, very about themselves, where this takes place within, let's talk about some of the characters. We're going to start with Thrawn. And we will exclusively refer to him as a daddy for the rest of the episode.
No. Maybe in my mind, but not out loud.
Okay, that's for another time, Sarah. This is a kids show.
This is not a kids show if you're going to refer to him as daddy for the rest of the episode.
What really worked for this book, again, we've already talked about it, but the switch to the third person perspective. And I actually feel like I learned more about Thrawn through other people than I did from Thrawn himself. Because all I really learned about Thrawn in the first trilogy was just how he thought, which I was like, this isn't really interesting to me. I'm just like, he's just saying things that he sees, which, like, I don't really need that. That's not really teaching me anything about him. But when you actually see the way that other people are processing the actions or thinking what his next step will be, or wondering how he's doing the things he does, actually having him question other characters and then them to get their internal thought process to try to get to the place that Thrawn wants them to be, and then see Thrawn's acceptance of, like, yes, exactly. That was, like, way more informative and way more of a learning experience for Thrawn than anything we've gotten before. Sarah, what did you overall think of Thrawn in this book? I know, again, you weren't really expecting to like this book as much as you did and the character, but in what ways did he intrigue you, surprise you, etc.?
Yeah, in the first trilogy, he was mega dull. I also did not enjoy hearing him go on for pages and pages about somebody's lip quivering ever so slightly, and that was their tell or whatever. Like, that was interesting, but it was not interesting in large meals. I needed it in little snacks, little bites, and not whole pages and pages. And what I really liked about this way of looking at Thrawn is that all these characters had a different point of view about Thrawn that were across the board. So Zistalmu and Thurfian really distrusted Thrawn, thought he was going to bring destruction, thought that he was a harmful player in the Chiss Ascendancy, whereas people like Bakif kind of respected him. Thalius really respected him and even turned cheery to respecting him after, she read about it and heard about his stories from Aralani. And Aralani also really respects him, but also maybe like, you can't see my face, but it is that it's a little bit suggestive.
I'm
there.
looking.
Yeah. Everything they say is innuendo, but that's not the point. There's a lot of different ways that the different characters in the book perceive him. Some perceive him as extra smart, some perceive him as extra dumb, and that really, to me, gave me a really clear vision of who he is as a person who thinks that he's right, a person who sees himself as a mentor to other people. And I want to shout out to Cheryl and Hannah in the Friends of the Forest Discord. We were having this conversation a little while ago, and they were saying, oh, you finally see him as I do, as a mentor figure. I've always seen him this way. So sorry it's taking me so long to come around to that point of view, but you guys are totally right about that. And he definitely mentors Thalius in that first moment when they meet. He mentors Cheery throughout, especially in that chapter 17 when she's learning to fly. He's really attempting to be this model for the people around him, and that's never something I saw before that I really thought was great.
And I think that has to do with the context of where he is, right? Because when you look at Thrawn in the Empire, he's still the same person, right? He wants to protect. His motive is to protect the Empire. But what's the Empire's directive? It's to enslave worlds and bring, quote, law and order. I've heard that somewhere before. And that's what? That's what they want to do, the Empire. They're bad guys. And Thrawn is a bad guy, yes, but he just wants to he wants to do the best job he can. But when you put that in the context of the Chiss Ascendancy, what that looks like is him protecting his own people. So it seems much more comforting. It seems much more like a mentorship thing, like you're saying. And it gives a more softer side to Thrawn than we saw in the last trilogy. And maybe that's why I related to him more in this book, because I can only take so much of Thrawn in the Empire, like being a bad guy, right? You gotta have that kind of gray area for characters where you see some of their softer attributes, and we definitely saw that. And at one point, him and Arlani are having a conversation of what the role of the ascendancy is supposed to be, and he says, quote, there has to be a middle path, because Arlani's like, we can't just rescue one world, because then we have to rescue the next, and the next, and the next, and the next. And that's even something we sometimes hear from our own politicians, right? Oh, we can't help those people, because then if we help these people, we got to help those people, and then we have to keep helping other people. Thrawn's kind of like the bipartisan of the Chiss, right? He's like, there's a middle path. Why can't we have both? Why can't we help people and also do whatever the hell you also want to do in preserving the ascendancy? Like, we can do both those things. They're not mutually exclusive. So I think that's why he's a very admirable character.
Yeah, it definitely allowed me to understand why he is the way he is. And I think one of the great ways that we saw that in this book is through art galleries. Art galleries. Oh my gosh.
Art?
I love this. I love this shit in a Star Wars.
Let's talk about some art for a little bit.
Let's. The ring art. These weavings art, those magical dresses that have 18 billion layers that they wear to those gatherings, and they have a new one every time at the market at that one planet. Art, like, there is so much talk of art and how you can understand people better through art, and that really helped me to understand Thrawn better, because art is something that I really cherish and value in my life. And so that gave me a connecting point to him. Also, when he gave the markers and the paper to Cheery, precious. We love that shit.
Oh my God. Such a dad moment. He would be a great dad. Just saying.
I feel like he might be a good dad, but then that kid would be a teenager and want to sneak out, and he'd be like, I know you went to that boy's house last night.
Jeremy, have you eaten your vegetables today? No, Dad, I haven't.
That kid would not be able to get away with anything, ever.
Jeremy, I noticed the clay sculpture you made at school. There's a slight edge, sloping angle, which means you are very hurt and sad. What are you sad about, Jeremy?
No. Jeremy, the sculpture tells me, it gives me the inclination that you have been relying lately on spice. You gotta stop using the spice to cope.
Jeremy's dating app profile. My dad's Thrawn, so beware.
Yeah, don't expect to have any secrets ever.
Know what you're getting into with my dad.
Yeah. Or maybe you don't tell people who your dad is. Maybe you just never bring your significant other home. You're like, it's better if they just don't know about my dad.
Jeremy, I noticed your girlfriend shivered when she walked through the door. Does she feel my presence is cold?
I feel like Thrawn would be one of those dads that'd be like, if you hurt my daughter, I carry guns,
I carry Purgle with me in my back pocket.
Yeah. But he'd be like, I see you. I got my eyes on you.
I can know your every move. Okay, anyways, we just went off on a daddy tangent there, so let's pivot. Pivot over back to the art.
Art galleries. Very suggestive things happening here. Very unsafe for work conversations that Aralani and Thrawn are having in these art galleries, I was scandalized. Scandalized, I tell you.
Arlani invites Thrawn to her quarters. And it says, Thrawn was silent a couple of steps. What is he thinking during those couple of steps? And this is before they go on to fight with each other.
But there's a moment when he's like, I know you're very good at exploiting your enemy's weaknesses. And I was like, oh, are you now, Aralani?
Ooh.
Oh. And then there was another moment where it's like, Thrawn is very controlling. And I was like, oh no. Oh no. This is too scandalous. Thrawn, Zahn, Timothy Zahn, what are you doing? This is an adult book, not an X-rated book. Jesus,
I'm sweating.
Christ. The children. Think of the children.
But some safe for work talk. Speaking of art, so at one point, Thrawn says, artwork reflects the soul of a species. We seek to preserve that echo for those unable to preserve it on their own. Damn, that is a juicy quote. That is so juicy. And I think that's really what sets Thrawn apart, right? Is this curiosity. I think it's why he has the intellect that he does. I think it's why he recognizes the larger threats that are out there. He's much more he's much more open-minded than a lot of other chiss, and I think that's why they're envious of him. I think that's why they're jealous, because they're like, why can't I be like that? Why can't I be as cool as Thrawn? It's why when he first meets Thalius and that one person interrupts and quizzes Thrawn and he like passes with flying colors, they like reprimand him immediately afterwards. Like, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? This guy, like, Thrawn is somebody you should be like cultivating to be your next leader of the Ascendancy. He should be a patriarch at some point. He's so smart. Not to say he's not without mistakes, but you know, he's on a much higher level than anybody else. And there's kind of this conversation going on between him and Cheryl, and Thrawn says all beings possess imagination to varying degrees. It can be encouraged and nurtured, or it can sometimes shine out in moments of stress. But curiosity is a choice. Some wish to have it, others don't. That right there, I really think speaks to him. He knows curiosity is a choice, and it's a choice that he makes. He wants to be curious. He doesn't just want to accept things the way they are. He wants to always look for what's beyond, whether it is studying art or whether it is identifying his opponent's weakness and using it against them through art, even. And I think that's what's fascinating about this. I think that's the core of his character, and it really kind of just ties everything else together. And that's why he relates to so many people and why so many people respect him, because he also has a curiosity about other people and learning about them and connecting with them on a deeper level.
At the same time, he's kind of like opposite Will Lark, because Will Lark is all about the empathy, and his curiosity and interest in others comes from a desire to empathize, whereas I think Thrawn's curiosity and interest in others comes from a desire to like deeply understand and to know. The empathy, anytime I can bring Will Lark up, I will, but like the empathetic understanding versus the logical understanding is really interesting if you look at these two characters kind of side by side.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of some of Thrawn's weaknesses too, Sarah, even though we talk a lot about how he's good at the military side of things, politics is not his strong suit, and we kind of get some more insight into that throughout the book. Someone is talking to him, I think it's Bakif, and they say, or it might actually be Aralani, I forget who it is, but they say warfare is straightforward. It's a time where you can gather allies, identify objectives, collect resources. There's a lot of time in which those things can happen. But in politics, everything is constantly shifting. Stuff is done behind doors with quick words and a little bit of writing, and it's very, very quick. And Aralani says, you know, like how some people are tone deaf to music, Thrawn is tone deaf to the nuances and intricate self-serving dances that made up the world of politics. Aw, he's just trying his best, Sarah. But this hurts him later down the line when he joins the Empire, because the Empire, despite it being a military force in the universe, is completely political. Everybody's backstabbing one another behind closed doors.
Yeah, and it makes sense because he has a desire to like deeply understand, but politics is not as easy as looking at a tapestry and understanding how it was weaved, because so many people have a hand in weaving it, or to weaving it how they like, and what they say is not what they mean, and everybody is having quiet conversations behind closed doors and not disclosing that. So politics is difficult, and it makes sense that he excels in this one thing and not in this other. But that's where somebody like Aralani comes in and kind of bridges that gap, and she acts as both the logical side complementing Thrawn, and also this person who, born into the Arizi family, is part of this ruling power for a large part of her life, and understands this political realm and how she functions and how the world functions in it. And so that makes a really interesting complement to me, them together, and how they interact with one another versus how Thrawn interacts with some of the other characters.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Thalius is a really interesting character because she kind of acts as this lesser figure in a sense. She doesn't have quite the same status as Aralani or Samacro or Thrawn or Bakif or any of these people. She actually kind of has a somewhat low status, and she kind of has to build her own place with Cheery. And she's, in a way, playing that political game throughout the book. And it's interesting to see her not excel, but participate in, and also, I guess, ultimately excel. She passes the trials and all that, but participate in this game that is being played in order to attach herself to Thrawn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and speaking of Thrawn and Thalius's relationship, it's a very unique one, because we get that first memory with Thalius, and she's really unsure of what's going to happen with her future, and she's a Skywalker, she's starting to lose her abilities, and Thrawn's there to reassure her that we all face uncertainty, but we have the power to choose among the various paths, right? And it goes back to that idea of the middle path. You don't just have to be a Skywalker, you just don't have to be a nobody who lost all of their powers. There's a middle path that you can choose and still have a very fulfilling life. Her realizing that in that moment is very powerful for her, because she realizes that there is some hope in her future, and that she's not just there to serve one purpose, and when that purpose is done, that's it for her, basically, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then she acts in that capacity for Cheery, and Cheery comes to realize that, even though she makes mistakes along the way, Thalius has this very unique perspective to help her out as one of the best momishes she's ever had. It feels weird saying that word out loud. It makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah. In the audiobook, it's pronounced momish, which is perhaps even weirder. It's interesting that somewhere along the way, between 100 years ago and when this book takes place, that the Skywalker caregivers were no longer former Skywalkers themselves. This is something that, to me, I have not quite pieced together, this disconnect, and how the Skywalkers are either taken from or given to the Ascendancy by their families. How after their Skywalker time is over, they don't wish to return to their families. They wish to get as far away from that life as possible. And that's all interesting to me, and something that I still feel confused about. It doesn't all click together for me, but it's all interesting, I think, to note.
Yeah, and we find out Thrawn had a sister. I don't think we knew that before.
I'm not sure. Yeah.
But she disappeared when she was 5. He was 3, so she's 2 years older than him. That's exactly what he talks about. He talks about Skywalkers wanting to fade away, and even though they have regret, they also have hopes that they know will never be fulfilled, and I think that's a lot of weight for them to carry, right? They served one purpose in their life, and it's almost like you feel used and thrown away and tossed aside, and I can't imagine that sort of feeling. It's like, where do those people have a place in society, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's definitely a tough bone to chew on. I think I know what you're saying there.
Yeah, it doesn't all click with me as to why there wouldn't be more care given to the Skywalkers, and as to why that they are so disconnected from every aspect of Chiss life other than their status as a Skywalker as a young person. And I hope we learn more about that in the future, because it's something that I have some issues with, and we can get into that. But it's a very complicated system, clearly, and something went wrong. And I want to know what went wrong.
It's interesting, too, because connecting it to our own world and sort of Western culture, I guess, there's this very idea that maybe we don't take good enough care of our elders. You know, we put them in these nursing facilities, they grow old, and we don't take as good of care of them as we could. So likewise for the Skywalkers of the Chiss Society, they're sort of the elders, the wise people of society who have this ability and who so much of the rest of that civilization depends on, that it's like, why don't we take better care of them? They're the ones that have kind of built us up and made us who we are and allowed us to travel the stars and work with other civilizations and find new species to align ourselves with and find those threats and suppress them immediately so that they're no longer a threat. You know, why don't we treat them better? It's just an interesting thought. Connection.
That is an interesting thought. I had not put that together. I think you could also posit Mithroiacroid, the patriarch, and how he ran away essentially during Thalius's trials to speak to Thalius, as also how they treat the elders, how they've essentially replaced him already discarded him.
Right.
And I think that has something to say as well. But with Cheery and the Skywalkers, I think it can also, if you'll let me, if we're going to transition to kind of talking about how women are portrayed in this book, it's a very interesting way to frame women within this narrative. And there's a lot going on here that I have a lot of conflicting ideas about, because clearly Thalius, Aralani, Cheery all have their own identities. They all are unique people with their own power and their own agency in a way, but they are also people who exist within this very, very rigid structure where, at least for Cheery and Thalius, it only looks to me, or as we understand it in the book, Skywalkers are only girls.
Yes.
That are taken when they're like babies and used up until like puberty, like 13, 14, and then discarded. You have to have caregiver credentials in order to be like an official caregiver. Families are ruled in this patriarchal structure where at the head of the family there literally is a patriarch. In addition, we only know of men within the Syndicure and Aristocra. Outside of Aralani, I don't think we know any women who hold family names. Clearly, there are women to birth these men. Clearly, there are women in this society, but they don't play a role in this book and this narrative, and I found that to be interesting, a little problematic, that they don't even exist at all. Like, we don't know about really any women outside of Aralani, Cheery, Thalius, and Mutro are the four that I can distinctly remember.
Well, there's the other caregiver as well, and the other Skywalker, Abig, I think her name was.
Yeah.
That funny enough, Sherry was like, "I don't want to hang out with this girl." Which I was like, "We've all been there as a kid. We've felt that before."
Yeah, but again, those women, those two that you just mentioned, the caregiver and the Skywalker, both exist
also
within that
fit
very
that
rigid
structure.
In addition to that, so I'd like to see Zahn improve on this, because while it passes the book, you talked about it earlier before I finished the book, while the book passes the Bechdel test, there are multiple named women who have conversations that are not about a man. There are conversations about Cheery's vision of herself, her self-acceptance and that sort of idea, what her place is in the world. They all seem to be revolving around Thrawn in a lot of ways. And the language in the book demonstrates this as well. In chapter 16 specifically, there are a handful of times where somebody is referred to as a female. It happens when the ring is given to Thalius, when she's used as a prop in front of Thrawn. She's like, oh, they really respect their females or whatever. That was interesting. It happens again I believe in chapter 16. It happens again during the conversation with the patriarch. I really love that chapter and that conversation, but there's also a moment where it's like, your job is to be a woman around Thrawn and protect him or whatever. And so that's kind of weird to me. And then also there's a comment by Wootro, and she said, and you really think a woman can talk them down? Wootro, who is a woman, persisted. So like, I think the women in this book are really interesting, and I really love Thalias as a character, and her interactions with Cheery I think are really great. But at the same time, there is still a lot of room for improvement by Timothy Zahn, I think, in this department, and I would love to know more about the women of the Chiss Ascendancy, because I think if we're thinking about the future of Star Wars, if we're thinking about a galaxy far, far away where anything can happen, to be stuck in this really patriarchal, hierarchical society where women are not even a part of the narrative outside of the few that I can name on one hand, it's disappointing. And I'm curious to know if you saw some of these things, if this is something you picked up on at all as a reader, and it's okay if you didn't, and what your thoughts are about it.
I do think this book, like you said, passes the Bechdel-Wallace test. And there are a lot of moments, especially the moments between Thalias and Cheery, were just so like wholesome and heartwarming, and to just have moments when they're just talking about like their nightmares and their dreams that they would have and just bonding over that and her helping her through some of that trauma. I thought that was really great. And as I was reading it, and I was like, don't mention Thrawn. Don't mention Thrawn. Don't mention Thrawn. And they don't. And there's moments and chapters and conversations where that happens and Thrawn's never brought up. And that's fantastic. It gives them some agency. But then again, like you said, you have those moments where Thalias is talking to the patriarch and he tells her to watch over your commander. I cannot help but feel that he holds the key to the Ascendancy's future, whether that future be triumph or ultimate destruction. And that right there kind of, again, it doesn't necessarily ruin the book for me, because there are so many other moments where the women are not talking about Thrawn or existing to serve a purpose for Thrawn, but it does address an area of opportunity, like you said, for Zahn to maybe think about the way in which he's writing some of these women characters to not ultimately end up in a place where we look back at this trilogy and say, yes, all those characters just served for Thrawn, because that would be really disappointing, right? Like, I want all these characters to exist. I would love a narrative in book 2 where Thalias is just kind of completely on her own, displaced from Thrawn, doing something very different, not even involved whatsoever, and just having like her own journey. That's it. Like, that would be great, honestly, and just having her, give her even more agency, because that's really important, like you said, as we expand Star Wars and have more characters that we can see ourselves in, especially women, so I think that's definitely important.
Yeah, it's 2020, and it's time we stop referring to women as females. I mean, there are specific contexts where that is an appropriate word to use over woman, which is more of like a gender identifier. But at the same time, that stuck out to me as like, oh God, why are we using this word? It's a personal pet peeve I have in the real world. So to see it extended into the book in 2020, a little disappointing. And again, I do agree with you. I hope that we get to see Thalias off on some mission that, is aiding Thrawn, is maybe adjacent to this narrative, overarching plot and direction that they're headed towards, because I think she's important to all of the pieces. But at the same time, for her not to be a literal pawn when she's being used as a hostage, or when she's being used as a shield. And while that clearly shows bravery on her behalf that she's doing these things, it also really boxes her into a role and a life that is not led by her. So I'm hoping we get more in the next book, and I'm hoping we get an expansion of that. And hopefully in this darker middle chapter that we might be getting with the Jixtus, we'll get maybe them splitting up in a way that allows Thalias to really have a mission of her own and to dive in on her own in a way that isn't predetermined and dictated by Thrawn.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. I don't think Zahn wrote the women completely problematic. but I also don't think it was perfect by any means, right? There was pros and cons to what he did with those characters. And yeah, in terms of the ending with them being used, two women as pawns for Ye of the Benevolent, I was kind of like, okay, like, now we got to rescue the two women. Thrawn's going to come in, save the day, sort of feel, which it was a little bit of an eye roll, but it was also kind of a badass moment when Thalius tore off her mask that she had, and she had those canisters inside, and we kind of get her experience as she's going through that and trying to survive, which, like, again, they could have, they definitely could have faltered under pressure, but there were some moments that were written throughout where it's like, oh, I'm confident because I know I can tell Thrawn's confident, so now I'm confident. And it's like, no, just be confident because you're you and you're awesome, and that's enough. But
yeah, I'd love to see the plan not dictated by Thrawn, because clearly that Tava mist in the prosthetic is something that's dictated by Thrawn. And also, if I may say, nothing to do with the women in this story, but I felt a lot of Star Trek in this Star Wars book. I don't know if you felt this, but like I felt
the Klingons and stuff with the mask. That's what I was imagining. Yeah,
absolutely. Klingons. We've got the Academy stuff. We got like the beginning stuff. Really reminded me some of like the Starfleet kind of high command council type people. And also there is its own version of the Kobayashi Maru, with this test that he is claimed to have cheated in. He didn't cheat in it. He just like figured out the parameters of the situation, and I was like, this is major Trek, which was kind of fun to see, and I think I prefer the Trek vibes to some of the Harry Potter kind of school vibes that we got from something like Dooku Jedi Lost. And I'm not saying that really any of these franchises own this sort of idea or vibe, but I liked some of the more technical military stuff versus some of the slightly like campier school kid vibes. But that's really not an important critique.
So I know we've kind of jumped around a bit amongst many different women characters in this book. I do want to hit on a couple of things among them and hear your thoughts. But with Cheery in particular, the quote that stuck out with me the most within the book for her was from Thalius's perspective. And it's when Cheery on page 262 says, "I'm not a child." And this is a moment in which Thalius realizes that that's actually true to some extent, because the stuff that Cheery has had to go through in such a short amount of time is more pressure and stress than any Chiss might have within an entire lifetime. And I think this was such an important thing to see, to really understand the constant pressure and expectation to perform for Skywalkers. And it's almost like meta in a way, right? Because Anakin Skywalker himself is a character that is expected to perform because he is the chosen one. And it's funny how the Skywalkers are sort of the chosen ones of the Chiss. They're the ones that are endowed with this ability that has a half-life, So yeah. I just kind of thought that was an interesting parallel there, and it really just grows your appreciation for her as a character and really gets you into her mind and understand why she has those moments where she cries or where she gets worried she's going to get lost, because like you don't know what's going to happen if you do. You don't know, like imagine being a kid and you're guiding a military fleet and you just want to like draw with crayons. I mean, that's a lot of pressure to face,
Yeah, and it's a lot of there's a lot of pressure that comes from, I think, being kept a secret. The Skywalkers as an idea are very secret, and so there's a lot of pressure to perform so that the cover is not blown. I think there's a lot of pressure to perform because she is the only young person amongst a crew of adults, and specifically of like adult men who, as a young girl who is taken care of by a woman, that might be a little bit of like an intimidating situation to be in. So yeah, her moment when she's like, "I'm not a child," really does illuminate the way that the pressure manifests for her and what she's dealing with.
And the fact, too, that the Skywalkers aren't actually supposed to know about the missions that they're going on. And that was an aspect that I enjoyed of this book. They let Cheery in on a lot of what was happening, and that gave her this sort of fresh layer of maturity and confidence that we see by the end of the book. And watching her learn how to fly with Thrawn was just one of the best parts of the book. It was amazing because Cherie is always having these nightmares of falling, and Thrawn tells her, you feel helpless in the water, so you dream of drowning. You feel helpless in the air, so you dream of falling. Let's take some of that helplessness away. And I know, again, it kind of gets into that thing of like, let's have Thrawn help the woman character and that sort of thing. And that's definitely problematic in some sense, but I also think there's a lot on Cherie's part to be willing to take on those tasks and to learn quickly and to not kind of crumble under pressure, because ultimately it's her choice that to learn this skill and have the confidence in herself. And I think that confidence is definitely built up in many of the conversations that she has with Thalius, and specifically one conversation when they are talking about their nightmares. I think these two things connect with learning with Thrawn and Thalius. Thalius tells her, just trust yourself, just have confidence, because if you're always worried about getting lost, you might freeze up and not go anywhere or try anything. That almost speaks back to what Thalius learned from Thrawn about just don't worry about what's in your future. Just like live in the moment, do the thing, try it out. And I think that conversation between Thalius and Cherie helps Cherie to want to learn and not be afraid. And I think that's where that balance is with Thrawn's writing of women characters, because yes, Thrawn helps Cherie, but Cherie learns those skills and that confidence from Thalius, and their very intimate, isolated conversation. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that Cherie is kind of the exception when it comes to these women characters, because she is a child. She does ultimately need guidance, and her arc is kind of like finding what her own sense of bravery and her own sense of self looks like. And so I think that Thrawn helping her and aiding her and opening her eyes in that particular way is not patronizing, and is not lessening Cherie's agency as a character. And I think that in particular is allowing her to find her own agency, because it's something she doesn't have as a young child, who is a part of this Skywalker program. So I think that's where I want to differentiate between the children and the adult women within the book, because I do think that Thalius is treated differently than Cherie in terms of the framing of their mentorship. Another quote that I thought was really interesting is relating to Thalius, is said by the myth patriarch, and it is, failure can be a harsh but capable teacher, and that's in chapter 18.
Yes.
And first of all, that reminded me of The Last Jedi, of course.
Yes, and naturally. Yes.
This
patriarch is the Yoda of the Chiss.
Honestly, he pops up for a moment. He has a good scene.
Yeah.
And then he kind of fades into the background. Definitely. And
don't you want to be in the room, just a quick question, with all the patriarchs? Like, they probably have their own Jedi council. Like, all the different patriarchs of each of the families, the 9 families, sit in like a room.
Oh my God, they'd be fighting all the time. None of them are happy with each other. I'm certain of it. But this quote sparked the idea of, I don't think that this trilogy might end in success for Thrawn, but might end in success for Chick Stews. Because at some point, Thrawn does transition from being this person in the Chiss and being this person who is attempting to be a military leader in the Chiss to being somebody who is banished by the Chiss and joining with the Empire. So there's perhaps a little bit of learning to be done on his part.
I could not agree with you more, because when we look at the place that Thrawn's at in that very first book, when he's discovered by the Empire, he's in the lowliest of places ever. Mm-hmm. And to be so powerful in the Empire like he is, and to just be so cunning and so ahead of the game, he's got to learn to fail at some point. And we haven't truly seen Thrawn fail. Everything he does always seems so well executed, so planned out, so articulated. It's almost like he has no weaknesses, right? We see some moments where he falters a little bit, but never truly fails. And I'm still waiting for that. That's like my one complaint, is he just never fails. So I would love for the trilogy to end in failure. And the patriarch says we have to take risks. We have to have risks because that's what's going to make us maintain our position. If everything is just calculated and well planned, it's not going to lead us anywhere. It's just going to kind of make us become irrelevant.
Yeah, stagnant. And that's why I think the facade of the political system is so interesting, because it is something that is stagnant within the culture. It doesn't evolve. The people that are in power maintain power. The system maintains power. Even if the patriarch of the myth says, oh, we need to evolve, and I think Thrawn is the key to that, he's not doing anything personally to rid himself of power or to change the power directly for the next generation. So that's an interesting thing to consider as well, that while he believes in change, he doesn't do anything to actually incite that change on a structural level, because it means that the system would kind of fall apart. The system that gives him power.
And I think an important element here with this conversation between Thalius and Patriarch is Thalius says failure is only a capable teacher, quote, when those who observe it learn from it. That means failure can be ignored. You can ignore failure, and that's the wrong thing to do. You should not do that. You have to recognize it and learn from it. And I think that's ultimately why Thrawn will get banished from the Chiss. The Chiss are going to ignore whatever failure happens and boil it down to Thrawn doomed us. We saw it in the water. We figured it was going to happen either for good or for bad, and it happened for bad. Nothing to learn. You're banished. Whereas Thrawn's going to get isolated on this planet, and then he's going to sit and boil and like just engross himself in his failure and eat it up. Nom, 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 nom. And he's just going to think about that for so long, so that when he finally gets the chance to prove himself again, which is in the Empire, he's going to be one of the most cunning admirals ever.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yep, that's it.
I'm just so
Good
excited.
job.
I love failure.
I can't top that.
I love failure in Star Wars, Sarah. It's so good.
It's good when it doesn't apply to Will Lark. Will Lark must win all the time.
Yeah, no, he's only a winner. Only a winner.
He deserves only good things, but everybody else can fail. Should fail.
Last thing I'll say on Thalius is nut paste sandwiches exist in the Star Wars universe. That is exciting.
Yeah, it's so interesting how we got that, but also got like regular words like car and babysitting and shipping container and voice to script, or like, voice to text, and also fine-grained pictures. Fascinating. The merging of like, where does real world Earth culture writing, how far does that get into Star Wars, and where do they merge and where do they not merge? I love how like nut paste sandwiches is a thing, but like car. Like, I really love that.
So we've talked about the good guys. Let's talk about the baddies, Sarah. Yiv the Benevolent, Kilori shitbagger. I hate Kilori. I hate him.
Actually, I listened to the audiobook, and it's pronounced Kilori of Yuan Dualin, so it's actually not pronounced shitbagger, although you might think that by looking at the text itself.
Kilori is a piece of garbage. We do not stand.
Yeah.
I will die on this hill.
I think I tweeted something along the lines of like, Kilori sucks. None of my friends like Kilori.
He had so many chances to turn back and do good, and he just never did. And even when he's on death's door at the very end of the book, he still is a shithead. Yeah,
I really don't think that the villains in this book, the antagonists in this book, have a ton to do. Yiv the Benevolent is just kind of like a jerk. And he's like a jerk, and his symbiotes are gross and remind me of whatever his name is in Pirates of the Caribbean with his like tentacles. But he is creepy and weird and kind of gross, and nobody likes him. And Kilori is also like creepy, weird, gross, and nobody likes him. And he's also really annoying. And so I feel like the villains in this book didn't have a ton to do, because they were really the prelude to Jixtus, who we'll get more of in the next book, whoever he is. But like, he's who I'm really curious about, and we only got 2 pages of him. So I don't think that Yiv and Kilori are like that important, and I wish they were built up to be a little bit more than like Thrawn's puzzle brain solving, like his puzzle brain solutions. But they were all right. They were serviceable.
Yeah, I think that's kind of all they served in this book, right? They're just tools because they're, again, Jixtus is the much larger villain that is out there. So it's just like, yeah, those guys sucked. So here I am. It's kind of like when Thanos in Avengers, the end credit scene where he gets the Infinity Gauntlet, the empty one for the first time, he just goes, "I'll do it myself." That's what this felt. That's what this felt like with Jixtus. I'm like, I love Jixtus a lot because
we literally get him for like 2 pages, and I brought him up like 10 times. Like,
but before specifically we get into Jixtus, couple notes on Keylori. I love the whole idea of the Navigators Guild and him being a void guide and how they can't talk about their journeys. It's like attorney-client privilege. It's like void guide client privilege. I love that little fun thing.
It's kind of weird. It's a really odd thing to think about, but I guess it makes sense because you need people to navigate.
Yeah. And the force, or this ability that allows him to navigate, is called the Great Presence. Whereas for the Chiss, it's called the Third Sight. So I always love when the Force is referred to as like different things within different cultures. It's always exciting. The Tide, yeah, from Legends of Luke Skywalker, so fucking good. So good. So I always just, it kind of always makes me so excited to hear that, because I think it really puts an accent on the idea that every culture has an idea of the Force. Likewise, our own world has different ideas of religion, and that kind of translates over to the Star Wars universe. So that's always great to see. You know, the Force isn't just a monolith. It's perceived and viewed and worshipped depending on where you grow up, and that's exciting.
Yeah, yes, I love different interpretations of the Force and Force powers as well, and I think that it was really interestingly talked about with the Third Sight and the Great Presence and that sort of stuff. And it makes me wonder why the Chiss lose that, and why it only seems that Chiss girls from like ages 8 to 14 have it. But maybe that's something we'll get more of in another book. Again, I need the Skywalker Chronicles of just Skywalkers and what went wrong. But kind of going back to the villains just a little bit here, the book kind of like ends with Keylori and Jixtus, and like I'm wondering about if Keylori is going to come back in book 2, if we're going to have to deal more with him, because he's really the worst.
Yeah, I would not love to see Keylori come back. I hope he gets Killoried.
He also has like the most annoying voice in the audiobook. I will not even lie to you. He sounds like a dweeb, but like
I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it. I have to say, I love the scene where Yiv and Thrawn finally meet, and it's like over hors d'oeuvres. Like,
yes.
And they're kind of having this conversation, and Keylori's just like, what the hell's happening right now? I love how Yiv calls Thrawn the Art Master.
Yeah.
And
Art Master Sforno.
Yes. Basically, they have this conversation, and then Yiv says, just because, you know, lances and swords or whatever weren't exchanged doesn't mean that wasn't war. And I just think it's so funny that like Yiv and Thrawn are having this like war of words. It's just fantastic.
Yeah, and Thrawn totally wins.
Yeah.
Or not Keylori. Yiv is so behind. He like thinks he has it, but like he totally doesn't, and that's what makes it pretty interesting. He's like, "Oh, I've got Thrawn figured out," and Thrawn is like, "You do not."
Yeah. One other thing about the cocktail party, I've never related more to a quote in my entire life, but Keylori talks about a dish that is a specialized dish that's a part of this party, and that it takes very certain digestive juices to handle. And he tells Thrawn, quote, "But you'd be surprised how many people will gladly trade a minute of delectable taste for an hour of gastric discomfort." Timothy Zahn, I have never been more seen in any Star Wars ever. How dare you, sir? How dare you call me out? I eat so much pasta and my stomach hurts afterwards and I complain about it. But the minute of delectable taste is just so worth it. So worth it, Sarah.
I'm really sorry that was the quote that really stuck out to you, that you related to more than anything. That's really rough.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
He called me out. I'm just saying. I'm just
He
saying.
called you out. Timothy Zahn. Tim, if I may, stop that.
One other note on Yiv the Benevolence, he certainly seems like a certain political figure in our current world. It talks about how he has both an ego and a temper. Kalori's worried about delivering bad news to him. His name is Yiv the Benevolent, so it quite literally has it both ways. He has both conquest by force and conquest by persuasion in his name. So he kind of puts on this facade that he is much more accepting and for the good of the world, sort of idealistic belief. But really, underneath it all, he's just all about conquest. He just wants to conquer as many worlds as possible into submission to do what he wants. So I just thought that was an interesting choice of a character type in this book as a villain. And that's, I guess, all I'll say on that, Sarah. Did you have any thoughts on you of the
Yeah,
benevolence?
I don't feel like I have anything to add. I think like that's all valid, and you said it all.
Sarah, I think we've come to the end of our discussion on the book. Before we head
Wow.
into some kind of closeout things with what's next for this trilogy and also hear from some of our listeners. But what would you like to say to close us out on the book, your final thoughts and your final piece with Thrawn Ascendancy?
Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think this is a book worth reading. We've talked about some of the highlights, some of the details that were really interesting. We probably could have gone on for 2 more hours about the teeniest, tiniest little sentences or words that stuck out to us. But at the end of the day, this is one worth reading. And it's one worth picking up if you don't consider yourself a Thrawn fan, or if you tried the last canon series and you said, I do not care about this character at all. Give this one a shot. There's a lot going on here, and I think there's something for everyone in this book. Despite some of its flaws, I think it's ultimately still worth reading, and hopefully it gets better in the second book. And I'm looking forward to seeing where this series goes, and I'm looking forward to learning more about Chickstews.
Absolutely, Jixtus. Yes, I agree on all accounts. It's not a perfect book, but it's a huge step up from the first trilogy, which I did not care for too much, besides some of the, great moments that it did have. This book really just throws you into the Chiss culture, gives you a political thriller, gives you a lot of great action, some really intimate character moments, and presents some new interesting themes for Thrawn. Again, the idea of choice and the idea of what it means to fail and to help people. And there's just so much baked into the Chiss civilization that is different. It's different from the traditional Star Wars that we know. And that's good because we need more different. So again, despite its flaws, it's a breath of fresh air. It's a nice break from the familiar, even though we do get Anakin Skywalker who appears. It's not the focus of the book. The focus is Thrawn. It's the Chiss. It's the political thriller. It's the social dynamics. It's the environments that they're within. It's the one step ahead of the other sort of mentality. It's a game of chess, basically. And this time we're actually rooting for Thrawn to win because he's fighting for the good fight, and I love that. So I would definitely recommend this book. And I want to ask you, Sarah, what is next for this trilogy? So again, we get Jix at the end of this book, and it presents a really interesting dilemma. He talks about how the Nick Cardoon were heavy-handed, destructive fools that would break so easily. So we're going to have a crazy force to go up against in these next few books here to close out this trilogy, but does this spell well for the rest of the trilogy? Do you think this could have some potential of an Alphabet Squadron trilogy or of an Aftermath trilogy? Where do you think this is so far falling amongst the Star Wars publishing trilogies that have been out? I know it's hard to say up front because we only have one book, but what is your gut telling you? What's next?
I think there's a lot of potential for this series to be really, really great. I think it's going to be stronger than the last Thrawn series by leaps, bounds, and miles. I think that Zahn has created a really complex, independent world and culture that will evolve over these next 2 books. And I can't believe how dense this book was and still interesting to read because I feel like I got 8 seasons of a show in this book alone. And we're getting, probably 8 more seasons in the second book, 8 more seasons in the third book, because there's just so much going on. So I think there's good things for this series' future. I'm so fascinated to learn who Jixtus is. He's, this omniscient kind of voice to Keylori at the end here, which is really ominous and very curious. So I'm interested to see where we go from here. And I think that we're going to get a lot more war, a lot more political drama and fallout, and hopefully some more interesting plots. So I think we have good stuff in store. I hope that it will rank up there with something like Alphabet Squadron, which is has my heart. I love that series.
My biggest thing for the future of this trilogy is I just hope for more in-depth analysis of these characters besides Thrawn. I think we really need to continue with that, really flesh out Thalius and Aralani and Cheery and just these brilliant characters that Zahn has now created. Continue with them. Don't make Thrawn the focal point, even though it is Thrawn Ascendancy. Do what you can with them, grow them, because I think a lot more people are starting to attach themselves to some of those side characters. And that's really awesome. And I do hope, too, that we see more allies join the fight to preserve the Ascendancy. I mean, that ring given to him by those people, the Marok sub-clan, they could come back. That ring might be their, that might be their entry into the Cool Kids Club. Be our ally. I have the ring. I have the secret ring to say, hello, I need help.
It's me.
It's me. I'm part of the club. So I would love to see more just world building and not be so kind of closed off from everything else. Really show us and flesh out the unknown regions, because this is your opportunity to do so.
Absolutely.
So before we close out, I want to go through some of the feedback that listeners left us on Twitter. So something that we would try to do, especially for our book reviews, is incorporate some of your thoughts on the book as well. So we posted on Twitter asking to hear from you. And here are some of the responses that we got. So David Brady at mindful_Jedi said, Thrawn and Aralani were outstanding. Thalius' experience and the trials I also loved.
Big agree on Thalius. Yeah. Another comment that we got was from Lutrosis at LUTRWSIS. They said that they would talk endlessly about the relationships between Thrawn and Aralani and Thalius and Cheery and Bakif, and how everyone is helping and supporting Cheery, and how Thrawn is appreciating these other three with their unique capabilities. How Aralani, Thalius, and Bakif are putting their trust in a Thrawn, despite how the majority of the Chiss are seeing him. They've had a lot to say. The history between Aralani and Thrawn, and how they are going on dates, and she took him to her homestead. Lutrosis, we saw the same
Love
thing.
It.
Yes, there is so much in these moments in the book. It's wonderful, especially each of their moments with Cheery are just so precious. Aralani watching her while Thalius is away, Thrawn's teaching her to fly, and the two of them successfully completing their mission, and all of Thalius' moments with her, every one of them really elevates the story. I have to certainly agree. There's a lot of good, interesting, deep character moments here.
Hannah at Beskar_Kyber15 says, I love the fact that so many people from all corners of the fandom enjoyed this book, especially if they really weren't into Thrawn before. Sarah, that's at you right there.
It's me.
I also love getting to know so much more about the Chiss after they've been around for almost 30 years. Kyle Larson also added here, good boy Daddy Thrawn continues to honor Star Wars parenting of 2019 and 2020. I have to agree there.
Yes. Thank you for that comment, Kyle. We also got another comment from Autumn Gale at Argent_Gale, who said, I love how devoted Thrawn is to his people, even if it seems that they don't care too much for him. He and Aralani's dynamic in this book is fantastic. Thrawn showing his parenting side with Cheery was lovely to see. I'm so glad that so many people in the comments in our discussion today, Brad, have really caught on to this parenting aspect of Thrawn and have picked that out as a moment that they really like, because it's definitely very soft and sweet and good.
Yes, it's the more nurturing side of Thrawn that I've wanted, and we certainly got it. And another message from Cheryl at Cheryl K. Bell, who says, this book just reinforced my love of Thrawn even more, and I didn't think that was even possible. I loved getting to know Aralani more. She is fast becoming a favorite character. I also require canon tales of Chiss slumber parties. Also, Thralani, I need all the fan art stat. Cheryl, we're with you. We probably didn't talk about it enough, Sarah, but
where is the fic?
The fic. We need it. The ship has left the building. We are Thralani shippers. It's happening.
Oh yeah. 100%. Seriously, somebody link me to that tag on AO3. I need it. Thank you. That's all. Why Salamary_Queen, I probably butchered how you actually say that. So sorry. Said, I really enjoyed seeing the subtle changes over time of how Thrawn interprets the world around him as his experiences go beyond the borders of the Chist Ascendancy, anticipating seeing how his views continue to shift in the next 2 books as we approach the 2017 novel's timeline.
Yes.
I definitely have to agree.
That's going to be the most fascinating thing, is seeing how these 2 trilogies weave into each other. I love that. And I know, Sarah, you weren't a huge fan of the Anakin Skywalker thing, but I think as we see more of that, even just like little dribblings of it, it'll be really fascinating to see kind of the complete 6-story arc of Thrawn and kind of where he ends up. And our last message here is from Bruce at Hey Bruce writes. He asks, I'm mid-book, but as with all Thrawn books, I love how careful and tactical Thrawn is. These books are all about people who are damn good at their jobs, and I love that. Love that too. Also interesting that the Ascendancy isn't evil. It has political problems, but it doesn't seek to dominate. I always think of Thrawn as a different kind of imp, whose evil is more calculating and less vindictive. In this, I think we're learning that approach is not a product of Chiss culture, but an individual trait. Though his care and reticence seem to be cultural, he's an outlier. I've often wondered how much of Thrawn's brilliance and approach were cultural or species-based. Fun to see how, even among Chiss, he's an odd duck. I wish I had read this book before reading the other books in the current canon, as these introduce Arlani more fully. I love Thrawn as the odd duck. Fantastic.
He really is, though. He really is. He's like the runt of the litter. He's the odd duck. You know, like he really is such an outlier. Not somebody that people want on their side, but like don't actually want all of him and all of what he has to offer.
And I love how Bruce mentions too, Thrawn is not a product of Chiss culture. He's a product of his own individual self. And we even talked about that, you know, it's really the choice for Thrawn to be curious and to ride with that and not just be what his culture tells him to be. And that's why the chaos begins to rise. Because when you have the order and you have the little bit of disorder, Sarah, that disorder is eventually going to overwhelm. And Thrawn is full of disorder. Certainly.
Yeah, and before we close out entirely on this episode today, I want to speak for just a little moment about the dedication. At the end of the book, at least in this ebook copy I have, it says, "For all those who stand on the edge of chaos." I don't have a lot to say about that, but I thought it was somewhat profound and interesting, and also like, oh boy, we're all at the edge of chaos right now. We are in the chaos. This is a hot mess. But I thought that was a really eloquent and sweet dedication that I think allows us to all kind of see power within ourselves.
Absolutely. I think that's a perfect way to end. So, Sarah, thanks for joining me for this Thrawn-tacular episode. I can't wait till we're here next year at some point talking about book number 2 in the trilogy. What do you think it's going to be called? Got any guesses?
It's going to be called Thrawn Ascendancy, book 2, Daddy Thrawn.
Oh,
I'm so sorry.
God.
I'm so sorry. I can't believe that came out of my mouth.
No. My guess was going to be Daddy Time. So we were close. Same brain cell.
Our one brain cell was really working overtime there.
Yes. Wow. Well, Sarah, in the meantime, until Thrawn Ascendancy Daddy Thrawn comes out, where can our listeners find you online? And what do you got going on?
You can find me at Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, and Goodreads at SCH221, and you can find me sometimes on YouTube at Sarah Vlogs Thoughts. I'm kind of bad at updating it, but I'm trying.
Excellent. And as for Friends of the Force, make sure wherever you're listening to rate us 5 stars and leave a review. And you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. You can also join our Patreon, which if you want to support the show in a very, very easy way, that is the best way to do so, starting at only $1 a month at patreon.com/friends of the force. Thank you, Anna, Cheryl, Deborah, Donnie, Elegy, Marie Claire, Marvin, Neil, Rachel, Sarah, and T for being proud members of the Friends of the Forest Patreon. So that is it for this episode, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to go vote on November 3rd. That is important. Or before. And until then, for all those who stand at the edge of chaos, thank you for listening, and may the Force be with you.
Bye.
Friends of the Force is a proud member of the Star Wars Escape Pods network. To learn more about our sister shows, find us on Twitter at WeAreEscapePods. The Star Wars Escape Pods network, promoting positivity in fandom.